So when you think of John F. Kennedy, what's the first image? For most of us, it's the wealthy, charismatic figure, maybe the airy playboy of popular memory.
Absolutely. That relaxed, almost effortless charm.
Exactly. But how does that image actually square with the incredibly serious, policy-driven intellectual who prepared himself so meticulously for the presidency?
That gap is everything, and it's really what this book is all about.
It is.
Yeah.
And today, we're going to approach this book in a new way. We want you to discover a new, in-depth approach to book coverage with this extended summary.
That's right. So unlike our previous review, which was more of a focused analysis, this is a comprehensive overview.
We're tracing the intellectual roots, the key arguments, and the real-world impact of this subject. If you appreciate this expanded format, let us know. Your feedback will really help shape future content.
Our focus today is Fredrik Logevall's first volume, JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917-1956.
And it's so important that he stops there, in 1956. This isn't about the presidency.
No, not at all. It's about everything that came before. The making of the man.
Our mission is to track those formative years, his education, the travel, his war service, those early campaigns that forged his unique internationalist outlook.
And we should mention, you're experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM, which lets us have these deeper, more dynamic book summaries.
It's the education of an American heir, set against the rise of the United States as a global superpower. Let's start at the very beginning, with the roots of his ambition.
Okay, so JFK is born in 1917. The Kennedys are, of course, immensely wealthy, but Logevall makes it clear right away that the money wasn't enough.
Right. They were an Irish Catholic family, and they were still seen as outsiders by the American establishment. They were striving for acceptance.
It's a fascinating paradox, all this privilege, but still this feeling that they had to prove themselves. That ambition really fueled everything.
And crucially, that ambition wasn't initially aimed at John, was it?
Not for a second. Logevall really emphasizes his role as the second son. He was often sick, his health was fragile, and he was always in the shadow of the heir.
Joe Jr.
Joe Jr. He was the one their father, Joe Sr., was grooming for political greatness.
And that dynamic, being the other son, might have actually freed him up in a way.
It seems so. Even at prep school, at Choate, you see the difference. Sure, he was witty and a bit of a rebel, but he was also more bookish than his brother. He was devouring history, reading about current affairs.
So let's talk about his father's influence. Joe Sr. was the ambassador to London right before World War II, and he held some pretty controversial appeasement views.
Very controversial.
Does the book suggest that JFK's own intellectual awakening was already putting him at odds with his father's thinking?
Oh, absolutely. His time at Harvard, especially from 1937 onwards, just accelerated that. The threat of war in Europe was becoming so obvious, and it sparked his curiosity.
So while his father is in London arguing for accommodation with Hitler,
his son is at Harvard and then traveling through Europe, seeing firsthand that the peace was crumbling. Logevall really highlights these travels. He wasn't just a tourist. He was sitting in on debates in the British Parliament, immersed in the crisis.
and that experience led directly to his senior thesis.
Exactly. It was this deep dive into why Britain had been so unprepared for the war, and it eventually gets published as the book, Why England Slept.
But wait, there was a lot of skepticism around that book, wasn't there? The criticism was that it was heavily edited or maybe even ghostwritten by his father's staff to promote the family name.
Yeah.
How does Logevall defend it?
He tackles that head on. He treats it as a genuine intellectual turning point. He uses early drafts and letters to show that, yes, Joe Sr. absolutely used his connections to get it polished and published.
Of course he did.
But the core argument, this sharp critique of how parliamentary democracy failed to respond to an authoritarian threat, that was distinctly John's. It showed he was already a committed internationalist, completely different from his father's isolationism.
So if that book was his intellectual trial by fire, then World War II was the literal one, his service in the Navy.
Yes, and specifically the PT-109 incident. It becomes central to his entire public image.
Logevall must spend a lot of time on this.
He does, but he focuses on the brutal reality of it. A Japanese destroyer literally slices his tiny boat in half in the middle of the night.
And the book goes beyond just the heroism of the rescue.
Oh, yeah. It highlights the strenuous, days-long effort to save his injured crew, the sheer physical toll of finding a way to get rescued.
How does that experience shape his view on leadership? Does Logevall connect that moment to his later policies?
He does. He points to Kennedy's private reflections from that time. They're grim. He saw with total clarity the gap between grand strategy made by commanders miles away and the catastrophic results in the front line.
A healthy dose of skepticism.
A profound skepticism about military bureaucracy. It instilled a caution in him that you see later in his foreign policy decisions, especially when it came to committing troops.
And then, during the war, comes this immense family tragedy, the death of his older brother, Joe Jr.
It changes everything, instantly. The presumptive heir is gone. Logevall argues that this just completely reshaped the family's expectations.
The mantle is passed.
The mantle of ambition, which was meant for his brother, now falls on him.
And he fills that vacuum, but gradually. He has that brief but really important stint as a journalist right after the war.
It was like an extension of his political education. He's covering the founding of the United Nations, the start of the Cold War in Europe. He's not just waiting around, he's watching the New World Order being built.
Which brings us right to his life as a political campaigner,
Yeah.
starting in 1946 with his first run for Congress in Boston.
Right, and the book details this as a classic Kennedy campaign.
Sure.
Strategically brilliant, well-financed, of course, with huge family backing. But they also combine that with a really energetic grassroots effort, leveraging his war hero image perfectly.
He's in the House for 3 terms, and the book makes it clear he's not just marking time, he's traveling a lot, focusing on foreign policy. Is there a specific example of that?
One of the best is his trip to French Indochina in 1951. While most American policymakers were only seeing the fight against communism, Kennedy was privately writing about his deep skepticism of French colonialism there.
So he was already thinking beyond the standard Cold War talking point.
Way beyond. It shows a real intellectual maturation. He was developing his own worldview long before he got to the Senate.
And that ambition escalates quickly. 1952, he decides to run for the Senate.
A huge leap. And he's challenging Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., a pillar of the Republican establishment. This race really puts him on the national map.
The book also puts this campaign in the context of the 1950s, especially the rise of television as this new political force.
Yes, and the Kennedys just got it. They understood its power to connect directly with voters, to bypass the old party structures.
How do they use it better than Lodge?
Logevall points to their TV spots. They were carefully crafted to showcase John's youth, his charm, his mentality. It made Lodge look stiff and old-fashioned by comparison. It was a masterclass in using new media.
Before we get to the end of this volume, we just want to mention Mindful Moments. It's our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques.
All of it is aimed at inspiring reflection and rational thought. It's also really valuable if you're an aspiring author looking for deep dives into narrative and structure.
So after the campaign, the book moves into his growing national profile. And of course, his marriage to Jacqueline Bouvier.
And Jackie is portrayed as much more than just a society wife. She's sophisticated, whip-smart, and socially skilled.
Logevall presents the partnership as something that really increased his public visibility, adding this layer of cultural polish to his political image.
Definitely. So by the time he's established in the Senate, he's a truly articulate voice on foreign affairs, often taking stances independent of and even critical of the Eisenhower administration.
And Logevall is always setting this personal story against that massive backdrop of the emerging American century. You have the debates over isolationism, the Cold War, McCarthyism.
And he shows Kennedy navigating all of it. The central themes really are this political maturation, the responsibilities that come with being a great power, and that tension between privilege and public service.
And the proof, the evidence he uses to dismantle that playboy image, is JFK's own writing.
Precisely. His letters, his diaries, his early journalism, Logevall treats them as these crucial artifacts that reveal his evolving thought process. It shows he was a serious student of history and power long before he aimed for the top job.
Which is why the volume ends where it does, in 1956, with his bid for the vice presidential nomination, which he doesn't get.
But it leads to his final decision, to aim for the presidency in the next cycle. The transformation from the second son into the conscious contender is complete.
It's an incredible journey.
Yeah.
So if Logevall suggests that JFK increasingly became his own political boss by the early 1950s, it leaves a really interesting question for you to think about.
What specific intellectual foundations, from his writing, his travel, his early views on colonialism, what allowed him to eventually diverge so completely from his powerful father's worldview? That's something to mull over.
For a much deeper analytical take on this book, click the link on screen for the in-depth book critique.
Subscribe, share, purchase via the link, and always think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.